In May of 1998, a catastrophic and tragic incident unfolded at the Harvestime bread factory in Leicester, highlighting severe lapses in workplace safety and corporate negligence. The factory, owned by Fresha Bakeries, operated large-scale bread ovens that required meticulous maintenance and strict safety protocols. However, when a grid fell into one of the ovens, Health and Safety Officer Dennis Masters decided to resolve the issue in-house rather than consulting with experts. This led to a series of poor decisions that ultimately ended in disaster. 2 men were sent into the oven, unbeknownst to the absolutely horrific events that lay ahead. But what exactly happened that day? Let's talk about it. This is the infamous death of David Mays and Ian Erickson. The Harvestime plant in Thurmaston Boulevard, Leicester, was owned by Fresha Bakeries. The two formed the same corporate group and specialised in bread making on a large scale. Their factory in Leicester was their primary factory and employed a decent amount of people. In the factory, there were 3 bread producing ovens, which essentially were long metal tunnels which operated at 260 degrees centigrade. The dough, carefully placed in tins, is set on a conveyor belt that measures roughly 20 metres in length and 3.3 metres in width. The conveyor, which nearly occupies the full width of the oven, begins its journey on one end, carrying the dough slowly through the baking chamber. Moving at its maximum speed, the conveyor belt requires 17 minutes to make its way from the entry point to the exit of the oven. As the dough travels through the oven, the consistent pace ensures thorough and even baking. The process concludes with the baked dough emerging from the other end of the oven. Dennis Masters was the Health and Safety Officer and Chief Engineer for the Leicester site and had been since joining the company in July of 1997. In May of 1998, a grid that was placed inside of the oven fell off the conveyor and landed on the oven floor in bread oven B. This was a safety hazard, so Dennis decided it had to be removed. He also decided that he didn't want to call the manufacturers of the oven to deal with the problem, and that they would retrieve the grid themselves in-house. They had never done this before. Dennis got in contact with Mr. Ian Erickson, a maintenance engineer who was based in the Walsall plant. He was employed by Harvestime and had over 20 years' experience in working with bread ovens. They also asked David Mays to assist him. He worked within the Leicester plant as a boilerman, but also did general handiwork around the plant. On the 15th of May, 1998, just before closing down the factory for the night, bread oven B was meant to be switched off. This would give the workers 8 hours before having to go inside, and they believed that this would be sufficient in allowing the oven to cool to a safe temperature, and this would have worked if they actually shut the oven down, which they did not. The next morning, on the 16th of May 1998, the oven was switched off by one of the factory workers at 9 AM. It is unclear why it wasn't switched off the night before, but it is safe to assume this was to keep bread being produced for profit. To help them get to work, the grills were removed from the conveyor to create a gap in which the men could enter the oven. Their job was to enter the oven, crawl along the conveyor belt, and retrieve the fallen grid. The amount of negligence regarding safety was off the charts. According to court documents, they had to keep moving with the gap as the conveyor belt moved along, or they would be trapped and crushed, so they essentially had to move on the conveyor belt. The men arrived to enter the oven at 11 AM. This was only 2 hours after it had been shut off. David's parents stated, "The oven wasn't turned off till 9, and my lad went in at 11. A couple hours, 2.5 hours at the most cooling down. It wasn't nowhere near sufficient. It should have been closed down getting on for 10 to 12 hours. The company knew 2 hours was not enough, so in order to cool down the oven quicker, they set up large fans to blast cold air through it, speeding up the process." The 2 men were sent into the oven with walkie-talkies, and their only protection were all-in-one suits. According to reports, no one, it seemed, looked at the temperature gauge at the side of the oven, which would have indicated it wasn't safe to go in. Yep, before the men were sent in, nobody bothered to look at the temperature gauge. The front where they climbed in was cool due to the fans, but the rest of it was not. If someone would have just looked at the gauge, they would have found out that the middle of the oven was still 100 degrees, or 212 degrees Fahrenheit. The men had to move with the conveyor, which went in one direction. As stated before, it would have been a 17-minute long journey to the other side. After a few minutes, Ian Erickson went on the walkie-talkie and sent a panicky message in which he said he was too hot and that they needed to get out of there, but there was nothing on the outside the men could do. Prosecutor Anthony Barker said they were trapped. There was no system of reversing the conveyor and no system of getting them out of the oven. They essentially had to ride the conveyor belt to the other side of the oven in boiling temperatures. After about 10 minutes in the oven, the panic in their voice was obvious. The last message through the walkie-talkie was from Ian, where he screamed, "Get us out." Moments later, both men passed out. Another absolutely shocking fact is that on the other side of the oven, where the men were supposed to exit, the clearance was only 8 inches, meaning they wouldn't have been able to fit through that small gap anyway. Ian's unconscious body managed to make it to the end of the conveyor, but couldn't fit through the gap. Factory workers enlarged the clearance with a crowbar and then pulled him out. They tried to resuscitate him, but failed. He had extensive skin loss and bruising. The skin that was still on his body was red raw. He had been in the oven for 20 minutes. Meanwhile, David's body got caught within the oven and was still inside, trapped within the machinery. When firefighters finally got him out, he had burns over 80% of his body. Both men were dead. David's father said, "They were going into this bottom chamber and they were going to ride the conveyor belt along. Absolutely horrific. They had to carry on right through the oven until they got to the other end. Of course, by then, they were completely burned to death." He also went on to say that David trusted them. They told him to go in the oven, and he did. The factory was then closed down, and an investigation was launched. The Health and Safety Executive Officer said, "I have investigated many fatal accidents in my time, but I have never investigated an accident quite as horrific and tragic as this one." The coroner report stated that Ian Erickson died of circulatory collapse and heat exposure, whereas David Mays died from injuries he sustained from the machinery, burns, and heat exposure. It didn't take long for investigators to charge Harvestime and Fresha Bakeries under the Health and Safety at Work Act. Mary Lockwood said, "It is quite often very difficult to actually prove a link of evidence between directors and senior management within companies. However, in this case, there was such negligence that the Health and Safety Executive decided that there should be charges laid against them because this accident was completely preventable." The prosecutor of the case said, "Looking at the facts of this case, we say at once that we regard it as a very bad case. We find it extraordinary that Mr. Erickson and Mr. Mays could have been allowed into the oven where it had been cooling for just 2 hours. We find it equally extraordinary that no one checked the temperature gauges before the men entered the oven." He went on to say, "The job was not thought through. No risk assessment was undertaken. Had there been, it would have been realised that the men would be trapped in the oven for the time it took the conveyor to pass through the oven." 3 men were charged. These were John Bridson, the chief executive, Dennis Masters, the chief engineer, and Brian Jones, the production director. All 3 men pled guilty and were sentenced on the 17th of July 2001 at Leicester Crown Court. None of them received any form of prison sentence, but John Bridson was fined £20,000 and Dennis Masters and Brian Jones were charged a total of £3,000. Fresha Bakeries were then fined a total of £250,000. Harvestime were also fined £100,000. However, according to the BBC website, the 3 men charged escaped without having to pay costs. The family of David Mays were obviously disappointed with this. His mother said, "David was a good son. If his father and I needed anything, he was there. He used to come and take his dad for a pint, that sort of thing." His father went on to say, "He always used to come up and say, 'Come on, Pop, we're going for a pint.' I miss that. I miss it." Unfortunately, I could not find any information on Ian Erickson. After the court battle, which was 3 years after the incident, David's mother said, "It took the bakery 3 years to publicly apologise, and after 3 years, it sounded hollow." It is worth noting that on the day the men entered the oven, it was the date of the FA Cup final, and it has been claimed that they were rushing so that they could go home and watch it, but again, this is just hearsay. I believe the company has since shut down. This incident was completely avoidable, and my heart goes out to the families of David Mays and Ian Erickson, and may they rest in peace. As always, this is not an AI channel, I do everything myself, and if you appreciate my work, subscribe, and if you want to go the extra step to support the channel, maybe consider becoming a member. This case was quite big over here in the UK in the late 90s. Have any of my UK fanbase heard of it? It is shocking how lightly those involved got off. Let me know what you think about this case in the comments below, and as always, thank you for watching.